another monetary union that it talked a lot, or maybe not talked a lot in some sectors, is the CFA.
Yeah.
And the CFA is, well, it's a monetary union now essentially established by France, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like a lot of people that talk about it criticize it, and they kind of use the CFA to represent kind of what colonialism is, and that it has this, you know, this imagery of this colonial
Yeah.
power that has control over this monetary union. I don't know exactly the details of how the CFA works, but they say like countries that are part of the CFA have to give their resources to the French central bank. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how it works, but then again, the CFA has lasted over time, and there were countries that tried to leave and that came back, like Mali, or certain countries left and had their own currencies, and they completely had, economic instability.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit what the CFA is, and
Yeah. So there are two. So the CFA franc, of course, is actually two monetary unions. The one of the west and one of the east. And yeah, these are former French colonies that were after World War II were put in these monetary unions, and then as they acquired independence, the monetary unions just remained, and they're still active to the present day. Now, these monetary unions are they have central banks, two central banks, one for each region. Again, this is different from the eurozone because the eurozone has one central bank plus all the national central banks, but again, institutional setup. Um, so they have the central banks, but the the working of the CFA franc is falls underneath the French Treasury. So it's the French Treasury. The member countries of the CFA franc have to have an account at the French Treasury, and the French Treasury is essentially maintaining the value of the franc and its stability, or at least it requires a certain amount of deposits in the account. So there are what you said is correct, and it is indeed true that it is an example of new colonialism. Now, there are two different ways in which the CFA franc should be looked at, but commentators and academics have only looked at it in one way. So, who is in this monetary union? Because, see, the monetary union is amongst the countries in Africa. Okay, these two, I think it's 6 and 6. It's 12 members in total, if I'm not mistaken. And the commentators, however, have been focusing on the fact that there is some sort of dependency between France and the CFA franc, the two unions in amongst these 12 African countries. Nobody has really looked at the CFA franc internally and whether the countries within this monetary union are actually tiered hierarchically. So I agree with you, and indeed, the reliance on the French treasury does point to dependency, but I haven't seen anyone who looks at the actual members of the monetary union, not the guarantor, in a sense, of the monetary union, and whether that monetary union internally is asymmetric or works very well. I don't have an answer because I don't think that there is an answer yet. But I can tell you the way in which it is, the infrastructure behind it, in a way, is much more similar to the United States than Europe, and that suggests that to me that it might actually work better than the eurozone does internally. Again, I'm not assuming that France plays no role in this, just looking at the monetary union at the 12 member countries. But again, as I said, I don't think that there is any research looking at these asymmetries. I know that there are still relatively strong asymmetric So their answers to symmetric shock is very asymmetric. So if you look at the sexual balances, they actually move in very different directions because of their production systems. Some are very um, uh, export-led countries, and others are not export-led economies. So there is still quite a large degree of heterogeneity across these countries, but the institutional setup of the monetary union internally, not with France involved, is very different from the eurozone. And as I said, it reminds me more of the. It reminds me. It is more similar to the United States or just a country that has one central bank and a lot of regions. Okay, like a little bit like having England and Wales having one central bank, but being two different regions. And uh, so what you were saying about countries that might have left and then come back, it might be because the CFA franc, again, outside of the connection with France, might work internally, but it is then the connection with France that is a symmetric shock to all of the member countries that, of course, represents neocolonialism and should be severed uh, as soon as possible. But I'm not sure that, I mean, I am sure you could sever that and restructure the monetary union to make it work, perhaps with different exchange rates. But I don't think that you need to abolish the CFA franc per se only because you want to abolish the neocolonial tie with the French treasury.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, and I think the key word you say is as soon as possible. So is it really possible? And I mean now that this, and I think this colonial idea is quite important because there has been a growing, you know, movement, especially last year with all the coups happening against colonial powers,
Yeah.
especially in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And now there's even, more leaders that are coming in that just really want to push out, these colonial powers. And especially now, like in Senegal, there's a new president that's really wants to push out. He wants to go out of the CFA franc. And I was even seeing, showed me an article that the ECOWAS wants to establish their own monetary union. And I agree with you that it is, going forward, they should eventually establish their own currency, but how possible is it now, and should it be, how drastic should it be in between choosing economic stability and pushing away these colonial powers?
Um, that's a difficult question. I don't have an answer to it. I can tell you that um, the issue that the countries should be conscious of is that you might cut off the ties with the French colonial power, but you might end up being subordinated to the US dollar and or to another
Yeah, or
money,
even
or
like Russia, like you saw a
Russia or
lot.
the rand, maybe. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Clearly, the dollar is still the currency that we are using for primary products, for exchanges in primary products, and these countries tend to be exporters or at least or also importers of primary products. So it's we should be conscious that we don't really want to replace one hegemon with another or one dependency with another. I also know of peculiar things happening in the infrastructure, monetary infrastructure in the African continent. Like if you look at the southern countries in Africa, the South Africa is trying to expand its reach and the reach of the rand, precisely not with monetary union, but with the monetary infrastructure behind payments and exchanges. So it is trying to establish its own local power with via money, but without a monetary union. I do think that it is viable for African countries ECOWAS is the one that you mentioned. There have been, for ages, there have been plans of having an African-wide common currency. That's not going to happen. Or, let me rephrase it. You can have an African-wide common currency, but it doesn't have a common and single currency. You might have still national economies, but then have a system of clearing at the international level, at the continental level, where you say, okay, for all cross-border transactions with one another, we use this other currency, and we record surpluses and deficits, and we set out a mechanism that tries to rebalance deficits and surpluses so that nobody is going to have a burden for the repayment, or that the burden of repayment is shared equally amongst deficit and surplus countries. That is possible. Again, it becomes then a matter of a vested interests and and political economy. These proposals were made for the international monetary system in 1944 by Keynes as well, something similar at least. Uh, didn't win. Why? Because there was an American plan, the white plan, and then there was the British plan, and the U.S. wanted to establish its own hegemony and saw the
Mm.
internationalization of the dollar as the uh, as the linchpin of its hegemony, and that's why they went with the monetary system of Bretton Woods. So if you're able in the African continent to come up with a plan and to put it through the, of course, political process, there are, and especially these days with all the technological development with digital currencies and central bank digital currencies and so on, you might very well be able to establish institutionally coherent monetary union that serves that allows to reap the benefits of the common money without also bringing the cost of having a single money for all the members. Because I think when we think of monetary unions, we tend to take for granted that a monetary union means a common and single currency for all the members, but it doesn't have to be the case. We can have common currencies that are not the only currencies that we use in our countries, or uh, in the well, in our countries we're going to use our domestic currency, and then for cross-border exchange we might use a different one.
Okay.
So I think that is possible. It, of course, it is quite a revolution because it's never been done before. But I do think that actually it's never been done before because of the technological requirements that were not there. So in 1944, if you go there and you imagine having a system, an accounting system, so that all countries have domestic payments and then cross-border payments that use a different currency, and then you clear them, and then establish a method to have balances, surplus and deficits that expire, it becomes very difficult. But
Mm.
now that we have programmable currencies, for example, I do think that it is easier and it is more feasible to actually have a clearing union, for example, or some monetary arrangements that allow to reap the benefits of the common, but not the issues of the single money in terms of the development of a monetary union.